Sold as a maid to the coldest alpha king, she never knew her scent would awaken his mark. The chains around Alira's wrists were cold, but not as cold as the look in her uncle's eyes when he handed her over to the men from the palace. She did not cry. She had promised herself, 3 days ago, that she would not give him the pleasure of her tears. The wagon that carried her north rattled over broken stone roads for 2 days, and with every mile, the air grew colder, sharper, until the trees themselves seemed to bow beneath a silence that had no place for warmth. She was 17 when her parents died in the border raids. She was 20 now, and in those 3 years, her uncle Edmund had sold everything her family once owned, piece by piece, debt by debt, until the only thing left to sell was her. He called it an opportunity. He said the palace of King Draven Ashgrave paid well for servants, better than any household in the lower towns, and that she should be grateful someone as poor and unmarked as her would even be considered. Alira did not feel grateful. She felt like cargo. The wagon stopped before iron gates so tall they scraped the clouds. Guards in black armor, each one broad-shouldered and silent, opened the gates without a single word exchanged. Alira stepped down, her boots sinking into gravel the color of ash, and looked up at the castle for the first time. It did not look like a home. It looked like a warning carved out of stone, its towers sharp as teeth, its windows dark even in daylight. A woman with steel-gray hair, and a face lined by years of discipline, was waiting for her at the servants' entrance. She introduced herself only as Mistress Hollis, keeper of the household staff, and she did not ask Alira's name before she began reciting rules. "Do not speak unless spoken to," she said. "Do not look the king in the eyes. Do not enter the east wing after sundown. Do not ask questions about what happened 5 years ago. And most of all, never let him see you." Alira did not understand the last rule. Not fully. Not yet. But she nodded, because nodding was easier than asking questions no one wanted to answer. She was given a small room beneath the kitchens, no bigger than a closet, with a cot, a wash basin, and a single candle. It was more than she'd had in months, so she did not complain. Within a day, she was folded into the rhythm of palace life, waking before dawn, carrying water, scrubbing floors, mending linens, and learning the invisible pathways that servants used to move through the castle without ever crossing the eyes of nobility. The other maids spoke of the king only in whispers, and always with a kind of fear that went beyond respect. They said he had not smiled in 5 years. They said he had once been different, warmer, the kind of alpha who laughed loud enough to shake the rafters, but something had broken in him, some loss so deep that it had frozen whatever softness once lived beneath his crown. A young maid named Nora, barely older than Alira, became the closest thing to a friend she found in those first days. Nora was quick with a smile, despite the palace's cold reputation, and she took it upon herself to teach Alira the unwritten rules that Mistress Hollis had left out. "Never walk past the West Tower alone," Nora warned one evening, as they folded linens by candlelight. "That's where the old queen's chambers used to be. No one's allowed there, not even the generals." "Old queen," Alira repeated. "I didn't know the king was married." Nora's smile faltered, just slightly. "He wasn't," she said carefully. "Not officially. But there was someone. Before you came. Before any of us came, most likely. Something happened, and after that, he changed. Some people say he can't bond anymore. Some people say he doesn't want to. Either way, nobody talks about it, and you shouldn't either." Alira filed the warning away, the way she filed away every warning in this place, tucking it into the same quiet part of her mind where she kept the memory of her parents' faces and the sound of her uncle counting coins. She had learned, over the years, that survival meant becoming small, becoming quiet, becoming a person no one noticed. She intended to be exactly that kind of maid, unseen, unremarkable, safe. It was on the 5th night that everything changed. Mistress Hollis had assigned her a task that should have gone to someone more senior, but 2 of the other maids had fallen ill with a passing fever, and someone needed to deliver fresh linens to the private chambers in the East Wing before midnight. Alira knew the rule. Do not enter the East Wing after sundown. But Mistress Hollis herself had given the order, and refusing an order from the keeper of the household was not something a new maid could afford to do. She moved quickly through the stone corridors, her arms full of folded linens, her candle throwing long shadows against the walls. The east wing was quieter than the rest of the castle, colder somehow, as if the air itself remembered something the walls refused to forget. She found the chamber Mistress Hollis had described, knocked softly, and when no answer came, she pushed the door open just enough to slip inside, and set the linens on the chest near the door. She should have left immediately. She told herself that later, 100 times. She should have set the linens down, and walked away without looking around, without breathing in the scent of the room, the low burn of firewood, and something else beneath it, something wild and untamed, that made her pulse quicken for reasons she could not explain. That was when she heard the door behind her close. She turned, and there he was. King Draven Ashgrave stood taller than any man she had ever seen, his shoulders broad enough to fill the doorway, his eyes the color of storm clouds before they broke into rain. He wore no crown, no ceremonial robes, only a simple black tunic that did nothing to soften the severity of his presence. His face was carved from the same cold stone as his castle, sharp cheekbones and a jaw set tight, and for a long moment, he simply looked at her, as though trying to understand why a servant girl was standing in his private chambers at this hour. Elira's first instinct was to bow, to apologize, to make herself as small as possible. She began to do exactly that, dropping into a hurried curtsy, her words tumbling out in an apology about linens and Mistress Hollis, and orders she had not meant to disobey. But the king did not seem to be listening. His nostrils flared, just slightly, and something shifted in his expression, a flicker of confusion that did not belong on a face so practiced in showing nothing at all. He took one step closer, and Elira felt the air in the room grow tight, charged, the way it does before lightning strikes. "What is your name?" he asked. His voice was low, rough at the edges, like something that had not been used gently in a very long time. "Elira," she managed to say. "Elira, Your Majesty. I was only bringing linens. I did not mean to disturb you." He did not answer right away. Instead, he studied her the way a man studies something he cannot quite believe is real, his gaze moving from her face to her hands, to the space around her, as though searching for the source of something only he could sense. Elira had no way of knowing that in that moment, King Draven Ashgrave was breathing in a scent he had not encountered in 5 long years, a scent that reached into the numbest, coldest part of him, and found something still capable of feeling. "Leave," he said finally, his voice sharper now, almost angry, though the anger did not seem to be aimed at her. "Do not come to this wing again." Elira did not need to be told twice. She fled the chamber so quickly she nearly dropped her candle, and she did not stop moving until she was back in the safety of the servants' quarters, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. She did not understand what had just happened. She only knew that something about the king's reaction had frightened her more than his cold reputation ever could, because for one brief moment, he had not looked like a king carved from stone. He had looked like a man who had just seen a ghost. She did not sleep well that night. She told herself it was only the fear of having broken a rule, the fear of what punishment might come for entering the East Wing uninvited. But some quieter part of her knew that fear was not the only thing keeping her awake. There had been something in the way he looked at her, something that lingered in her chest long after she had left the room, a warmth she could not name and did not trust. The next morning, Mistress Hollis pulled her aside before the sun had fully risen. "You went to the East Wing," she said. It was not a question. Elira's stomach dropped. "You told me to," she said carefully. "You gave the order yourself." Mistress Hollis's expression did not change, but something behind her eyes sharpened, calculating, as though recalculating something she had not expected to need. "I did," she admitted, "and it seems the king took notice. He has asked that you be reassigned to kitchen duty, away from the private chambers, effective immediately." Elira felt a strange mixture of relief and something else, something she refused to examine too closely. "Did I do something wrong?" she asked. Mistress Hollis studied her for a long moment before answering. "No," she said slowly. "I do not believe you did anything wrong at all. That is what concerns me." Elira did not understand the warning hidden in those words, not then. She simply nodded, grateful to be moved somewhere she considered safer, somewhere far from storm-gray eyes and chambers that smelled of firewood and something wild beneath it. She spent the following days scrubbing pots and carrying water from the well, and slowly, The memory of that night began to feel like something she had imagined, a strange dream brought on by exhaustion and cold. But dreams do not leave a king, pacing his chambers long after midnight, unable to sleep, haunted by a scent he thought he had buried 5 years ago, along with everything else he once allowed himself to feel. And dreams do not cause a mark, long dormant, beneath a king's skin, to stir for the first time in half a decade, faint as a whisper, but unmistakably, undeniably alive. Elira knew none of this. She only knew that something in the palace had shifted, some current beneath the surface of her new life that she could not name, and did not yet understand. She told herself it did not matter. She was a maid, nothing more, and kings did not concern themselves with maids. She would soon learn how wrong she was. Days passed, and the kitchen became Elira's entire world. She rose before the sun to stoke the ovens, and she did not stop moving until long after the moon had claimed the sky. The head cook, a broad woman named Petra with flour permanently dusted into the creases of her hands, took a liking to Elira's quiet diligence, and taught her the rhythms of the kitchen, without asking too many questions about where she had come from. It was safer this way, Elira told herself. Buried in flour and steam, far from towers and thrones and eyes the color of storm clouds, she began to believe, almost, that the strange night in the East Wing had simply been a trick of exhaustion, nothing more. But then the summons came. It arrived on a gray morning, delivered by a palace steward with a face as unreadable as stone. The king required a server for the evening meal in the great hall, someone unfamiliar to the usual staff, since 2 servers had taken ill with the same fever that had swept through the maids' quarters days before. Mistress Hollis, out of options and short on hands, chose Elira. Elira wanted to refuse. She did not know how palace protocol worked in the great hall, did not know how to carry herself before nobility, and worse, she did not know how she would face the king again after the strange encounter in his chambers. But refusing an order from Mistress Hollis was not a possibility any servant in this castle entertained, not if they wished to keep their position, and certainly not if they wished to keep their uncle from hearing that his investment had been wasted. She spent the afternoon being fitted into a simple gray uniform, her hair pinned back tightly, her hands scrubbed raw from nerves as much as from soap. Nora helped her practice carrying trays without spilling, whispering encouragement between instructions. "You'll be fine," Nora said. "Just keep your eyes down and your hands steady. The king barely looks at the servers anyway. You could serve him 100 meals and he wouldn't remember your face." Elira wanted to believe that. She wanted, badly, for it to be true. But when she stepped into the great hall that evening, carrying a silver tray toward the head table where King Draven Ashgrave sat flanked by his generals and advisors, she felt his gaze find her before she had even crossed halfway across the room. It was not a passing glance. It was the look of a man who recognized something, who had been waiting, whether he admitted it to himself or not, for exactly this moment to come again. Her hands trembled as she set the tray before him. She kept her eyes down, exactly as Nora had instructed, focusing on the pattern of the tablecloth, rather than the man seated before her. But she could feel his attention on her, like heat radiating from an open flame. Impossible to ignore, no matter how hard she tried. "You," he said quietly, his voice pitched low enough that only she could hear it, over the low murmur of conversation filling the hall. "I told Mistress Hollis to keep you from the East Wing. I did not expect to find you here instead." Elira's throat tightened. "I was assigned to serve tonight, Your Majesty," she said carefully. "I did not choose this." Something flickered across his face, too quick for her to name, gone before she could study it. He said nothing more, simply nodded once, dismissing her with the smallest gesture of his hand. Elira retreated as quickly as decorum allowed, her heart hammering, and she did not look back to see whether he watched her leave. She did not need to look. She could feel it. That night, long after the great hall had emptied and the castle had settled into its usual midnight silence, Draven sat alone in his study, staring at nothing, his mind circling back again and again to a scent he could not shake. 5 years he had lived without feeling anything close to what he felt in that servant girl's presence. 5 years of careful numbness, carefully constructed, and in the span of 2 brief encounters, all of it had begun to crack. He told himself it meant nothing. He told himself scents could be similar without being significant. that his mind was simply playing tricks born of old grief resurfacing at an inconvenient time. He had built an entire kingdom on the foundation of never trusting his instincts again, not after what trusting them had cost him the first time. But beneath his sleeve, in the quiet of that empty study, the faint mark on his forearm pulsed once, warm and undeniable, and for the first time in 5 years, King Draven Ashgrave allowed himself to wonder if the coldest winter of his life might finally be ending. He did not yet know how much that thought would cost him. He did not yet know how far he would have to fall before he allowed himself to rise again. He only knew that somewhere in his castle, in a small room beneath the kitchens, a maid with a scent like sunlight after rain was sleeping without any idea of the storm she had already set into motion. Alira lay awake that night too, staring at the low stone ceiling above her cot, her mind replaying the moment his eyes had found hers across the crowded hall. She told herself it meant nothing. Kings looked at their servants sometimes. It did not have to mean anything at all. But some small, unguarded part of her did not believe that, and as she finally drifted into an uneasy sleep, she could not shake the feeling that her life, the quiet, unremarkable life she had worked so hard to build inside these cold castle walls, had already begun to change in ways she was not yet ready to understand. The scream came from the kitchen corridor just before dawn, sharp enough to jolt Alira upright on her cot. She was on her feet before she fully understood why, racing barefoot into the hallway, where Petra stood frozen beside an overturned barrel of oil, her face white as bone. A rat, someone said. Just a rat. But Alira's heart did not slow for a long while after, and she wondered, not for the first time, whether every quiet moment in this castle was simply the pause before something worse. Life in the kitchens returned to its ordinary rhythm within the hour, but Alira found she could not return with it so easily. She scrubbed pots with her mind elsewhere, thinking of storm-gray eyes across a crowded hall, of a voice pitched low enough that only she could hear it. She told herself, again and again, that it meant nothing, yet the telling did not make it true. 3 days after the dinner in the great hall, Mistress Hollis summoned her without explanation. Alira followed the older woman through corridors she had never walked before, past tapestries depicting battles long since won, until they reached a small office tucked behind the main administrative wing. A man she did not recognize sat behind the desk, his uniform marking him as a steward of some importance, his eyes sharp and assessing in a way that made her skin prickle. "This is Callum," Mistress Hollis said. "He handles matters of household security. He has some questions for you." Alira's stomach twisted. "Have I done something wrong?" she asked. Callum's expression remained carefully neutral. "Not that I am aware of," he said. "But the king has taken an unusual interest in your assignment, and it is my duty to understand why, before I allow it to continue unexamined. Where were you born?" The questions came quickly after that, one after another, about her family, her uncle, the debts that had led to her sale, the village she had grown up in before the border raids took everything from her. Alira answered as honestly as she could, though something in Callum's careful note-taking made her feel like a puzzle being assembled, rather than a person being understood. "Your mother," Callum said eventually, glancing up from his notes. "Do you know her family name before marriage?" Alira frowned. "Why does that matter?" she asked. "It may not," Callum said, though something in his tone suggested otherwise. "I am simply thorough. You may return to your duties." She left the office with more questions than she had arrived with, and none of them were answered that day, or the day after, or the week that followed. She tried to push the strange interview from her mind, burying herself once more in the familiar comfort of kitchen work, but the sense that she was being watched, studied, weighed against some standard she did not understand, never fully left her. Nora noticed the change in her almost immediately. "You've gone quiet," she said one evening as they sat together shelling peas by lamplight. "Quieter than usual, I mean. Something happen?" Alira hesitated before answering. "Do you know anything about a man named Callum?" she asked. "He works in household security." Nora's hands stilled over the bowl of peas. "Everyone knows Callum," she said carefully. "He's the king's most trusted man. Has been since before any of us worked here. If Callum's asking about you, it means the king asked Callum first." The words settled over Alira, like a weight she had not expected to carry. "Why would the king care about a maid from the kitchens?" she asked, though some part of her already suspected an answer she was not ready to face. Nora shrugged, though her eyes carried more worry than her gesture suggested. I don't know, she admitted, but I'd be careful if I were you. Whatever attention you've caught, it's not the kind most of us would want. Alira took the warning seriously, or she tried to. She kept to the kitchens as much as her duties allowed, avoided the corridors that led toward the private wings, and told herself that if she simply made herself small enough, whatever strange current had pulled her into the king's notice would eventually release her back into the safety of anonymity. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. It happened on a market day, when Mistress Hollis sent a small group of servants into the town below the castle to gather supplies the kitchen had run short on. Alira welcomed the errand, grateful for the chance to breathe air that did not carry the weight of stone corridors and silent rules. The town spread out beneath the castle, like a patchwork of color against the gray landscape, merchants calling out prices, children weaving between carts, a rare kind of ordinary life that felt almost foreign after weeks behind palace walls. She was examining a stall of dried herbs when she felt a presence settle beside her, close enough that she stiffened before she even turned to look. It was not the king. It was a young man with sandy hair and an easy smile, dressed well enough to suggest he was not a common townsperson, though not so well as to suggest nobility either. You're new to the market, he observed. I would have noticed a face like yours before now. Alira offered a polite but distant smile, the kind she had learned to give men who approached too easily. I work at the castle, she said, hoping the mention of her position might discourage further conversation. Instead, his smile widened. Even better, he said. I'm Garrick. My family supplies grain to the royal kitchens. Perhaps I'll see you there sometime. She did not think much of the exchange in the moment, offering only a brief nod before returning to her errands. But she did not notice the way Garrick's gaze lingered on her as she walked away, nor did she notice the careful, calculating way he watched her rejoin the other servants, filing away her face the way a man files away information he intends to use later. She would learn, in time, that not every danger in her new life wore a crown. Some dangers smiled and called themselves merchants, and some dangers waited patiently in market crowds for opportunities that had not yet revealed themselves. That evening, back within the castle walls, Alira nearly collided with the king himself as she rounded a corridor corner too quickly, her arms full of the herbs purchased that afternoon. She stumbled back, apologies already forming on her lips, but Draven caught her elbow before she could fall, his grip firm and warm, even through the fabric of her sleeve. Careful, he said, his voice quieter than she expected, almost gentle, in a way that did not match the cold reputation the entire castle whispered about him. Alira righted herself quickly, pulling her arm free the moment her balance returned, though the warmth of his touch seemed to linger longer than it should have. I'm sorry, Your Majesty, she said. I wasn't watching where I was going. He studied her for a long moment, and she had the distinct sense that he was breathing her in, cataloging something about her presence the way a man memorizes a song he cannot quite place. You went to the market today, he said. It was not a question. Alira blinked, surprised he would know such a detail. I did, she said carefully. Mistress Hollis sent several of us for supplies. Something tightened in his jaw, though she could not guess why. Be careful in the lower town, he said. Not everyone there means well. Before she could ask what he meant, he had already turned and walked away, his long strides carrying him down the corridor and out of sight, leaving her standing alone, with her arms full of herbs, and her mind full of questions that seemed to multiply faster than she could answer them. She did not know that Draven had already received word of Garrick's family from Callum days earlier, a family whose grain contracts had grown suspiciously generous in recent months, generous enough to suggest ties to a rival kingdom's growing ambitions in the north. She did not know that the king's warning had carried more weight than simple courtesy, that it had been born from a protectiveness he had not felt toward anyone in 5 long years, and did not fully understand himself. She only knew that something about the way he looked at her, brief as it was, made her feel seen in a way she had spent years trying to avoid. And in a castle full of rules designed to keep her invisible, being seen felt more dangerous than anything else she had encountered so far. That night, sleep came slowly, and when it finally arrived, her dreams were filled with storm-gray eyes and a warmth she did not trust herself to want. The following morning, Alira woke to find a small bundle placed outside her door, wrapped in plain cloth and tied with twine. Inside, she found a warm woolen shawl, finer than anything she owned, with no note attached and no explanation offered. She stared at it for a long time, turning it over in her hands, searching for some clue to its origin. Nora, when shown the shawl later that day, went pale with understanding, before Alira had even finished explaining where she found it. "That's not something a maid buys for herself," Nora said quietly. "And it's not something Mistress Hollis would give without saying why. Alira, I think you should be very careful about who you tell about this." Alira folded the shawl carefully and tucked it beneath her cot, unworn, unwilling to draw attention to a gift she did not understand and had not asked for. She told herself it might have come from anyone, a kind gesture from a fellow servant, a mistake meant for someone else entirely. But some quiet certainty in her chest told her otherwise, and that certainty frightened her more than she wanted to admit. Over the following days, small things continued to shift around her without explanation. Her kitchen duties grew lighter, though no one told her why. Extra portions of food appeared on her tray at mealtimes. Once, she noticed a guard positioned near the servants' stairwell who had not been there before, his eyes tracking her movements with a quiet attentiveness that made her uneasy rather than reassured. She began to feel less like a maid navigating palace life, and more like a piece being moved carefully across a board, whose rules she could not see. And though no one spoke the truth aloud, though the king himself had said nothing more than a brief warning about the lower town, Alira could not shake the growing certainty that whatever strange thing had begun the night she stumbled into his private chambers had not ended. It had only just begun. The ceremony hall had not been opened in months, but on the morning of the harvest court, its great doors stood wide, and every servant in the castle had been summoned to prepare it before nightfall. Alira found herself pulled from the kitchens for the day, assigned instead to polish silver, and arrange the long tables where nobles from across the northern provinces would soon gather to honor the season's end. She had never seen the hall filled with so much color, banners in deep reds and golds hanging from the rafters, candlelight multiplying itself across polished glass until the whole room seemed to shimmer. Mistress Hollis moved through the chaos with practiced calm, directing servants like a general, arranging troops before battle. When she found Alira arranging silverware near the head table, her expression carried an urgency Alira had not seen from her before. "Two servers have fallen ill," Mistress Hollis said without preamble. "You will serve the head table tonight. Do exactly as you are told. Keep your composure, and do not, under any circumstance, draw attention to yourself." Alira's stomach dropped at the instruction, memories of the last time she had served near the king rising unwelcome in her mind. But refusal was not an option she had ever truly possessed in this castle, and so she simply nodded, allowing herself to be fitted into a formal uniform, finer than anything she had worn since arriving. By evening, the hall had filled with nobility from every corner of the kingdom, lords and ladies dressed in furs and jewels that made Alira's simple uniform feel like a costume from another world entirely. She kept her eyes low as she had been trained, moving between tables with practiced efficiency, refilling goblets and clearing plates without ever meeting the gaze of the guests she served. She had almost convinced herself the evening would pass without incident when she reached the head table, where King Draven Ashgrave sat at the center, flanked by generals on one side and a woman Alira did not recognize on the other, a woman dressed in deep violet silk with dark hair pinned into an elaborate crown of braids. "That is Lady Wren," a passing server whispered to her as they crossed paths near the kitchen doors. "Her family controls half the southern trade routes. There's been talk of a match between her and the king for years." Alira did not know why the words landed with such unexpected weight in her chest, why something tightened uncomfortably beneath her ribs at the mention of a match. She told herself it did not matter, that whatever strange awareness had grown between her and the king meant nothing beyond simple coincidence, and she carried the next tray toward the head table, with her composure carefully rebuilt. But composure, she would learn, could not withstand what happened next. As she leaned forward to refill the king's goblet, her sleeve brushed lightly against his hand, the briefest contact. Gone in an instant. She murmured an apology and moved to step back, but Draven's hand shot out, catching her wrist before she could retreat, his grip firm but not unkind. For a moment, neither of them moved. The hall around them continued its low hum of conversation, oblivious to the frozen stillness at the head table. But Alira felt as though the entire world had narrowed down to the single point of contact between his hand and her wrist. She looked up, against every instinct that told her not to, and found his storm-gray eyes fixed on her with an intensity that stole the breath from her lungs. Something was happening beneath his sleeve in that same moment, though Alira could not see it. The mark on his forearm, dormant for 5 long years, burned suddenly bright and undeniable. A sensation so sharp that Draven's breath caught audibly enough that Lady Wren turned to look at him with open curiosity. "Is something wrong, Your Majesty?" Lady Wren asked, her voice smooth but edged with the kind of attentiveness that missed very little. Draven released Alira's wrist as quickly as he had caught it, his expression sliding back into its usual careful neutrality with practiced speed. "Nothing at all," he said, his voice even despite the tension still visible in the set of his jaw. "The wine is excellent tonight." Alira retreated from the table as quickly as decorum allowed, her wrist still tingling from where his hand had held it, her mind racing through 100 questions she had no way to answer. She did not see the way Draven's gaze followed her across the hall, nor did she see the way his other hand pressed briefly against his forearm beneath the table, as though trying to steady something only he could feel. The court historian, an elderly man named Percival who had served 3 generations of the royal family, noticed the exchange from his position near the hall's edge, his sharp eyes missing very little despite his advanced years. He had seen mate marks awaken before, decades ago, in the king's own father, and he recognized the particular stillness that had settled over Draven's expression, the barely concealed tension in his shoulders. He said nothing that evening. But later that night, long after the ceremony had ended and the hall had emptied of nobility, Percival requested a private audience with the king, an audience Draven granted with obvious reluctance. "Your Majesty," Percival began carefully, once the study door had closed behind them, "I have served this family long enough to recognize certain signs. Tonight, at the head table, I believe I witnessed something significant." Draven's expression remained carefully blank, though something flickered behind his eyes that suggested the old historian had struck closer to the truth than he wished to admit. "I do not know what you believe you saw," he said, his voice deliberately flat. Percival did not back down, despite the coldness in the king's tone. "I saw a mark awaken," he said simply. "I saw it in your father, before your mother arrived at this castle, though he tried to deny it for weeks before he finally accepted the truth. I recognize the signs, because I have seen them before, and I would be failing my duty if I did not tell you plainly what I believe is happening." Draven turned away, moving toward the window that overlooked the dark courtyard below, his back rigid with a tension that betrayed more than his careful words ever could. "It is not possible," he said quietly, more to himself than to the historian standing behind him. "Not after everything that happened. Not after I made certain nothing like this could happen again." Percival's voice softened, though his words did not lose their weight. "Marks do not ask permission, Your Majesty," he said. "They do not care what certainties you have built around your heart. If what I witnessed tonight is true, then something has already begun that neither of us can stop simply by wishing it away." Draven said nothing for a long time, staring out at the darkness beyond his window, his mind circling back to storm-colored memories of loss he had spent 5 years trying to bury beneath duty and discipline. He thought of the maid's wrist beneath his hand, the sudden burning warmth that had spread through his mark the moment their skin touched, a sensation he had convinced himself he would never feel again. "Leave me," he said finally, his voice quiet but final. Percival bowed and withdrew without further argument, leaving the king alone, with a truth he was not yet ready to accept. Draven remained at the window long after the old historian's footsteps had faded down the corridor, his forearm still carrying the faint warmth of a mark that refused to return to its long dormancy, refused to let him retreat back into the comfortable numbness he had spent 5 years constructing. He thought of Alira's face across the crowded hall, the careful way she had kept her eyes low, the quiet dignity she carried, despite a life that had clearly given her little reason for dignity at all. He thought of the warmth in her scent, the way it had reached past every wall he had built, and found something in him he had believed permanently extinguished. He did not want this. He told himself that firmly, repeatedly, as though repetition alone might make the feeling true. He had loved once, fully and without reservation, and that love had been stolen from him in a betrayal so complete it had nearly unmade him entirely. He had rebuilt himself into something colder, something safer, something that could rule a kingdom without risking a heart that could be broken again. He did not know, standing alone in his darkened study, that the very effort to protect himself from ever feeling this way again was about to fail more completely than he could imagine. He did not know that somewhere in the servants' quarters below, a young woman who had spent her whole life trying to remain unseen was already, without any understanding of what it meant, becoming impossible for him to ignore. Alira, meanwhile, lay awake in her small room, her wrist still carrying the ghost of his touch, her mind replaying the moment his eyes had found hers across the crowded hall. She did not understand what had happened at the head table, could not explain the strange charge that had passed between them in that brief contact. She only knew that something had shifted, some invisible current pulling her toward a danger she could not name, and did not know how to resist. She thought of Lady Wren's elegant violet silk, of whispered talk about a match years in the making, and something uncomfortable twisted in her chest at the memory. She told herself it should not matter to her who the king chose to marry. She was a maid, nothing more, invisible by design, and safer for staying that way. But as sleep finally claimed her, her dreams carried her back to storm-gray eyes, and a grip that had felt, for one brief moment, like something she had no name for, and no defense against. The following days brought a strange stillness to the castle, the kind that precedes a storm, without anyone quite knowing when it will break. Alira returned to her kitchen duties, grateful for the anonymity they offered, but she noticed, more than once, the weight of unseen eyes following her through the corridors, and she could not shake the growing certainty that whatever had begun in that crowded hall had not ended with the evening's final course. A week after the harvest court, Alira was summoned without warning to Mistress Hollis's office, and the moment she stepped through the door, she knew something had changed. Mistress Hollis did not meet her eyes at first, her hands folded tightly atop her desk, her posture stiffer than usual. "You are being reassigned," Mistress Hollis said finally. "Effective immediately, you will work in the far eastern wing, tending to the guest quarters and the old library. Your kitchen duties will be given to another maid." Alira blinked, confused by the sudden change. "Have I done something to displease the king?" she asked, unable to keep the worry from her voice. Mistress Hollis's expression softened, just slightly, though the tension in her shoulders did not ease. "No," she said carefully. "If anything, the opposite. But it is not my place to explain further. You will report to the Eastern Wing steward by midday." Alira left the office with more confusion than clarity, and though she wanted to press for answers, she had learned enough about palace life to know that some questions were safer left unasked. The Eastern Wing, she discovered upon arrival, was quieter than any part of the castle she had worked in before, its corridors far removed from the great hall and the private royal chambers alike. If this was meant as a distancing, it succeeded completely. She went days without so much as glimpsing the king's shadow. She told herself this was for the best. She told herself the strange pull she had felt toward him, the warmth of his hand around her wrist, the way his eyes seemed to see straight through every wall she had built around herself, was a danger better left behind in the busier corridors of the western castle. Distance, she reasoned, was safety, and safety was the only thing she had ever truly wanted since arriving at this cold, unfamiliar place. But distance, she would soon learn, changed very little of what had already been set into motion. Draven, for his part, had ordered the reassignment himself, convincing himself it was the responsible choice, the disciplined choice, the choice a king who valued control above all else should make. He told Callum it was simply a matter of efficient staffing, nothing more, though Callum's carefully raised eyebrows suggested he was not entirely convinced by the explanation. "You seem troubled, Your Majesty," Callum observed one evening as they reviewed reports in the king's study, reports that Draven had read 3 times without absorbing a single word. "I am not troubled," Draven said, more sharply than he intended. "I am occupied with the southern trade disputes, nothing more." Callum did not press the matter, though his silence carried its own quiet skepticism. He had served the king long enough to recognize distraction when he saw it, and he had noticed, more than once in recent weeks, the way Draven's attention drifted toward the servants' corridors whenever a particular kitchen maid's name arose in conversation. Meanwhile, in the Eastern Wing, Alira found herself drawn increasingly to the old library that made up half her new duties. Unlike the rest of the castle, The library felt untouched by the cold formality that governed everywhere else, its shelves crowded with books that had clearly gone unread for years, its high windows letting in soft afternoon light that warmed the dust-covered reading tables. It was here that she first encountered records of the kingdom's history, tucked among ledgers and forgotten correspondence she had been tasked with organizing. She had not intended to read anything beyond what her duties required, but one particular ledger, older and more worn than the rest, caught her attention with a name she recognized. The entry described a great betrayal 5 years past, a plot uncovered too late, involving a woman the king had once loved deeply, a woman who had, according to the careful handwriting, orchestrated an assassination attempt against Draven's own father, in exchange for promises made by a rival kingdom. The plot had failed, but not before costing the old king his life and leaving Draven, barely into his reign, to rule a grieving kingdom, while nursing a betrayal so complete, it had reportedly broken something in him that never fully healed. Alira read the account twice, her hands trembling slightly, as the pieces of the castle's whispered rumors finally clicked into place. This was the reason for the rules about the West Tower, the reason for the careful silence surrounding anything from 5 years past, the reason a king who had once, according to the ledger's account, been known for warmth and easy laughter, had become the cold, guarded figure the entire castle now feared. She closed the ledger carefully, returning it to its shelf, but the knowledge settled over her differently than she expected. She had assumed the king's coldness was simply a matter of temperament, an inherited severity passed down through royal blood. Learning it had been carved into him through loss and betrayal, changed something in how she understood him, softened an edge of fear into something closer to a difficult, complicated sympathy she had not expected to feel. She did not have long to sit with that realization, before circumstances forced her thoughts elsewhere. Late one afternoon, while cataloging correspondence in the library's furthest corner, Alira heard the door open behind her, followed by footsteps too heavy and deliberate to belong to another servant. She turned, expecting perhaps Callum, or one of the Eastern Wing stewards, and found instead the king himself standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable, his eyes finding hers with an intensity that made the air in the room feel suddenly thinner. "Your Majesty," she said, rising quickly and offering a hurried curtsy. "I did not expect anyone. I can leave if you require privacy." "Stay," he said, the single word carrying more weight than she expected. "I did not come here intending to find you. I did not know you had been assigned to this wing." Something in his tone suggested this was not entirely true, though Alira did not press the matter. They stood in careful silence for a long moment, the space between them charged with something neither seemed willing to name aloud. "I read something today," Alira said finally, unable to hold back the words once they began forming. "About 5 years ago. I am sorry, Your Majesty. I did not mean to intrude on matters that are not mine to know." Draven's jaw tightened, though he did not turn away as she expected him to. "Then you understand," he said quietly, "why certain rules exist in this castle, why certain doors remain closed." "I understand there was a great loss," Alira said carefully. "I do not understand why it should mean you must remain closed off from everything else for the rest of your life." The words left her mouth before she fully considered their boldness, and she immediately regretted them, certain she had overstepped in ways a servant simply could not afford. But instead of anger, something almost like surprise crossed Draven's expression, as though no one had spoken to him with such honesty in longer than he could remember. "You know nothing of what you speak," he said, though the words carried less bite than she expected. "Betrayal does not simply fade because time has passed. It teaches you what trust actually costs." "Perhaps," Alira said quietly, "but surely not every person carries the same danger as the one who hurt you." Draven studied her for a long moment, something shifting behind his storm-colored eyes that she could not fully name. "Careful, Maid," he said finally, though his voice had lost its earlier coldness. "You speak as though you understand things you cannot possibly know." He left without further explanation, his footsteps fading down the corridor, leaving Alira alone once more, among the dusty shelves of the old library. She stood there for a long while after he had gone, her heart still racing, wondering at the strange, fragile thing that seemed to be growing between them, despite every rule and every danger standing in its way. She did not know, as she finally returned to her cataloging work, that Draven had stood just beyond the library door for several long minutes after leaving, his hand pressed against his forearm, where his mark continued its slow, steady burn, wondering how a maid with no knowledge of what she carried had already begun to undo 5 years of careful, deliberate armor. Smoke curled through the eastern corridor before anyone raised the alarm, thin at first, easy to mistake for a kitchen fire, until the shouting began. Elira dropped the stack of ledgers she had been carrying and ran toward the noise, before she had time to consider whether running toward danger was wise. She found guards converging near the guest quarters, their swords drawn, their faces tight with an urgency she had never witnessed inside these walls before. "Get back to the servants' quarters," one of them barked at her, though she barely registered the words before Callum appeared, his usual composed demeanor replaced by something sharper, more alert. "Intruders," he said tersely, addressing the nearest guards rather than Elira. "Southern wall, at least 3, possibly more. Secure the royal chambers first." Elira did as she was told, retreating toward the servants' stairwell, her heart pounding with a fear she had not felt since the chaos of the border raids that took her parents years ago. She had barely reached the first landing when a hand seized her arm from behind, rough and unfamiliar, spinning her around to face a man she had never seen before, his clothing dark and nondescript, his eyes cold with purpose that had nothing to do with palace hospitality. She did not think. She twisted free the way instinct demanded, throwing her weight against the stairwell railing, and screamed loud enough that her voice echoed through the stone corridors. The man lunged again, but before he could close the distance, a young guard rounded the corner and threw himself between them, taking a blow meant for Elira across his shoulder that sent him crashing hard against the wall. Elira dropped to her knees beside the fallen guard without thinking, pressing her hands against the wound on his shoulder, shouting for help even as the sounds of fighting continued to echo through the corridors above. She did not know how long she knelt there, applying pressure with hands that would not stop shaking, before the fighting finally quieted, and the castle's guards regained control of the eastern wing. She did not notice Draven arriving, until his shadow fell over her, until his voice, sharper and more urgent than she had ever heard it, called her name. "Elira." She looked up to find him kneeling beside her, his eyes moving rapidly over her, searching for injury with a desperation that seemed entirely at odds with the cold, composed king the castle whispered about. He had felt it, she would later learn, the moment danger touched her, a sharp and undeniable pull through the mark on his arm that had sent him running through the castle faster than he had moved in years, abandoning every careful wall of distance he had tried to build between them. "I am not hurt," she managed to say, though her voice shook as badly as her hands. "But he needs help. He took the blow meant for me." Draven's attention shifted briefly to the wounded guard, already directing nearby soldiers to carry him toward the healer's quarters, before his gaze returned fully to Elira, studying her with an intensity that made the chaos around them feel suddenly distant. "You are certain you are unharmed," he said, his hand reaching to steady her shoulders as she attempted to rise on unsteady legs. "I am certain," she said. "Truly. But your majesty, what happened? Who were those men?" "Assassins," Draven said grimly, his jaw tight with barely controlled anger. "Sent by a rival kingdom, seeking to weaken this castle's defenses before winter negotiations. They will not succeed again." He helped her to her feet, and for a long moment, neither of them moved to step away from the other, the chaos of the fight still settling around them like dust after a collapse. Elira felt the warmth of his hand at her shoulder more acutely than she wanted to admit, felt the way his gaze lingered on her face as though reassuring himself, again and again, that she truly remained unharmed. "Come," he said finally, his voice gentler than she had ever heard it. "You should not remain here. I will see you somewhere safe myself." She did not argue, too shaken to protest even if she had wanted to, and allowed him to guide her away from the wreckage of the eastern corridor, toward the quieter halls near his private study. He settled her into a chair beside the fireplace, and though propriety surely demanded he summon Mistress Hollis or one of the healers instead, he remained beside her, pouring a small cup of warmed wine and pressing it into her still trembling hands. "Drink," he said. "It will help settle your nerves." Elira accepted the cup gratefully, though her attention remained fixed on him, rather than the drink itself, watching the way his careful composure had cracked in the aftermath of danger, revealing something rawer and more honest than she had seen from him before. "Why did you come yourself?" she asked quietly, once the wine had steadied her enough to trust her voice. Surely a king does not personally rush toward every disturbance in his own castle. Draven was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the fire rather than on her, as though the answer required more courage than he currently possessed. "I felt something," he said finally, his voice low. "When you were in danger. I felt it as clearly as if it were happening to me." Elira's breath caught. "What does that mean?" she asked, though some quiet, uncertain part of her already suspected an answer she was not ready to name. Draven turned to face her fully then, and for the first time since she had arrived at this castle, she saw something in his expression that was not carefully guarded, not controlled, not hidden behind walls of duty and discipline. "It means," he said slowly, "that I have spent 5 years believing I was no longer capable of what I am feeling right now. It means I do not know what to do with the fact that you may have proven me wrong." Neither of them spoke for a long moment, the fire crackling softly in the silence between them, the weight of his words settling over the room like something too large to fully comprehend. Elira did not know what to say, did not know how a maid sold to a cold king's household was meant to respond to a confession that upended everything she had believed about her place in this world. "I should return to the servants' quarters," she said finally, though her voice carried none of the conviction the words demanded. Draven nodded, though something in his expression suggested he wanted, badly, for her to stay. "Rest tonight," he said instead. "We will speak more of this when the castle is calmer, and when I have found the words to explain what neither of us yet understands." She left his study, with her mind spinning, the warmth of the fire and the wine doing little to steady the storm of thoughts crowding her mind. She did not know what he meant by the mark he had not fully explained, did not understand the strange, undeniable pull that had drawn him running through danger, simply because he sensed her distress. She only knew, as she finally reached the safety of her small room, that whatever had begun the night she first stumbled into his chambers had grown into something far larger and far more dangerous than she had ever imagined a maid's life could contain. The wounded guard survived his injury, thanks in large part to Elira's quick actions in the moments after the attack, and word of her courage spread quietly through the servants' quarters over the following days. Nora hugged her tightly when she heard the story, equal parts proud and worried, and even Mistress Hollis offered a rare nod of approval when their paths crossed in the kitchen corridor. But amid the quiet praise, a deeper unease settled over the castle. The attack had been the boldest attempt yet against the royal household, and Callum's investigation into the assassin's origins uncovered ties not only to the rival kingdom Draven had suspected, but troubling connections to certain merchant families within his own territory, families whose loyalty had apparently been purchased with promises of power once the current king had been removed. One name among those investigated made Elira's stomach turn cold when she overheard it mentioned in passing between two guards near the kitchen entrance. Garrick, the young merchant she had spoken with at the market weeks earlier, the man whose easy smile had seemed harmless at the time, but now carried a far more sinister weight in light of what the investigation had uncovered. She said nothing of the market encounter to anyone, uncertain whether it mattered, uncertain whether mentioning it might draw more unwanted attention toward herself, at a time when the castle already seemed far too interested in her presence. But the knowledge settled uneasily in her mind nonetheless, another thread in a growing tapestry of danger she did not fully understand, and had never asked to be part of. That night, alone in her small room, she thought again of Draven's words beside the fire, of the raw honesty in his expression when he confessed to feeling something he believed himself no longer capable of. She thought of the mark he had mentioned but not explained, and though she did not yet understand its full meaning, some instinct deep within her recognized that her life, once defined entirely by invisibility and survival, had become something else entirely. She was no longer simply a maid sold to pay her uncle's debts. She had become, whether she wanted it or not, someone the coldest king in the north could not stop himself from noticing, and that recognition carried with it a danger far greater than any assassin's blade. A summons arrived at dawn, delivered not by a steward, but by Callum himself, his expression grim enough that Elira knew before he spoke that something had shifted again. "The king requests your presence in the private council chamber," he said. Immediately. She followed him through corridors she had never walked, her heart hammering with a dread she could not fully explain, until they reached a heavy oak door, guarded by 2 soldiers who stepped aside without a word. Inside, she found not only Draven, but also Percival the historian, Mistress Hollis, and a woman she did not recognize, older, sharp-eyed, dressed in the deep blue robes of a healer. "This is Beatrice," Draven said, gesturing toward the healer without further introduction. "She has examined the mark on my arm and confirmed what Percival first suspected. I wanted you to hear the truth directly, rather than through rumor or whispered gossip among the staff." Alira stood frozen near the doorway, uncertain whether she was meant to sit or simply listen. Beatrice stepped forward, her expression carrying the careful neutrality of someone accustomed to delivering difficult truths. "Mate marks do not awaken without cause," Beatrice explained. "They respond to the presence of a true bond, one that exists whether either party desires it or not. The king's mark has awakened fully in your presence, a response that occurs only once in most lifetimes, and only ever toward one true match." Alira's breath caught in her throat. "Are you saying," she began, unable to finish the question aloud. "I am saying the king's body has recognized you as his true mate," Beatrice said plainly. "Whether either of you accepts that truth changes nothing about its existence." The room fell into heavy silence. Alira looked toward Draven, searching his expression for some sign of how he wished her to respond, but his face had settled into the same careful neutrality he wore in court, giving nothing away. She realized, with a sinking feeling, that this was not a joyful revelation being shared, but a complication being managed. "I understand this is difficult to hear," Mistress Hollis said gently, breaking the silence. "But the king felt it important that you know the truth, rather than remain confused by what has been happening around you these past weeks." Alira found her voice finally, though it came out smaller than she intended. "What happens now?" she asked. Draven answered before anyone else could. "Nothing changes," he said, his voice firm, almost harsh. "You will continue your duties as before. This changes nothing about your position in this household." The words landed like a slap, though Alira could not fully explain why they hurt as much as they did. She had not expected declarations of devotion, had not allowed herself to imagine any future beyond her current circumstances, but something in the flat finality of his dismissal cut deeper than she wanted to admit. "Of course, Your Majesty," she said quietly, dropping into a hurried curtsy before excusing herself from the chamber as quickly as decorum allowed. She did not see the way Draven's jaw tightened the moment she left, nor the pained expression that crossed his face once the door had closed behind her. She did not hear Percival's quiet, disapproving sigh, nor Beatrice's murmured comment that denial rarely served anyone well in matters the body had already decided for itself. Draven ordered her transferred again within the week, this time to the farthest wing of the castle, overseeing linens and storage in a section so distant from the royal chambers that weeks might pass without their paths crossing at all. He told himself this was wisdom, discipline, the same careful control that had guided every decision he made since the betrayal that had cost him everything 5 years ago. He told himself a maid, however remarkable her scent, however undeniable the mark's response to her presence, could not undo the lessons that betrayal had carved into him. He did not examine too closely why sleep came even less easily than before, why his hand found its way to his forearm dozens of times each day, tracing the mark that continued to burn steadily, despite the distance he had placed between himself and its cause. He buried himself instead in matters of state, in trade negotiations and border defenses, anything that might occupy his mind fully enough to forget the way Alira's face had fallen when he dismissed her so coldly before the council. Alira, for her part, retreated into her work with the same discipline she had always relied upon, folding linens and organizing storage rooms with quiet efficiency that left little room for the ache still lodged beneath her ribs. She told herself Draven's dismissal had been a mercy, not a cruelty, sparing her from hoping for something a servant born of debt and desperation could never truly have. She told herself repeatedly, though the telling never quite settled the matter as completely as she wished. Nora found her one evening in the distant storage wing, her arms full of freshly laundered sheets, her expression carefully composed despite the exhaustion visible beneath her eyes. "You've barely spoken since the council chamber," Nora said gently, setting down her own basket of linens to study her friend more closely. "Everyone's heard the rumors by now, Alira. You don't have to pretend with me." Alira set down the sheets she carried, allowing herself, for the first time in days, to acknowledge the weight she had been carrying alone. "He said nothing changes," she admitted quietly. "And I believed I could accept that, but it seems I cannot stop wishing it were different, even though wishing changes nothing at all." Nora wrapped her in a brief, fierce hug, the kind of comfort that required no further words. "Marks do not lie," she said finally, pulling back to meet Alira's eyes. "Whatever he says now, out of fear or duty or whatever is keeping him from admitting the truth, his body has already told him what it wants. Give him time. Cold kings do not thaw quickly, but they do thaw." Alira wanted to believe her friend's reassurance, though the following days offered little evidence to support it. Draven remained distant, matters of state consuming his visible attention entirely, and Alira settled into a quiet resignation that felt, in its own way, almost like relief. It was easier, she told herself, to expect nothing than to hope for something that danger and duty and 5 years of careful walls seemed determined to keep out of reach. She did not know, buried in the distant storage wing with her carefully rebuilt composure, that Callum's investigation into the merchant Garrick had uncovered evidence far more damning than anyone initially suspected, evidence that would soon bring danger crashing back into her life, in a way neither distance nor careful walls could protect her from. She did not know that the coldest king in the north, despite every attempt to bury what he felt beneath duty and discipline, found himself standing outside her old kitchen quarters, more nights than he cared to admit, unable to stop himself from seeking some trace of a presence he had told himself, repeatedly and unconvincingly, that he did not need. The fire began in the storage wing just after midnight, spreading fast through stacks of dry linens before anyone raised the alarm. Alira woke choking on smoke, her small room adjacent to the very storage chambers she had spent weeks organizing, and by the time she stumbled into the corridor, flames had already claimed half the passage leading toward the main stairwell. She pressed a torn strip of cloth against her mouth and pushed forward anyway, remembering that 2 younger servants slept in the chamber, just beyond the worst of the blaze, their names barely known to her, but their safety impossible to ignore. She found them huddled together, terrified, and guided them back through a side passage she had discovered weeks earlier, while cataloging storage inventories, a narrow servant's route that bypassed the worst of the flames entirely. By the time they emerged into the courtyard, coughing and singed but alive, guards were already flooding the eastern wing with buckets and shouted orders, and Alira collapsed against the courtyard wall, her lungs burning, her hands scraped raw from guiding the frightened younger servants through darkness and smoke. "This was no accident," she heard someone say nearby, though her vision swam too much to identify the speaker. The seat of the fire was set deliberately. Someone wanted this wing burned. The words settled over her with dawning horror, even as healers rushed forward to examine her injuries. She thought immediately of Garrick, of the investigation Nora had mentioned weeks before, of the growing certainty that danger had followed her from the market crowd into the very walls meant to keep her safe. Draven arrived at the courtyard before the flames had even been fully contained, his expression carrying a barely restrained fury that sent guards scattering to obey his rapid orders. When his eyes found Alira slumped against the courtyard wall, soot-streaked and coughing but alive, something in his composure shattered entirely. He crossed the distance between them in seconds, dropping to his knees beside her, his hands moving over her face and shoulders with a desperation he made no attempt to hide. Not before the gathered guards, not before Callum, not before anyone. "You are hurt," he said, his voice rough with an emotion far too raw for a king who claimed nothing had changed between them. "I will be fine," Alira managed, though her voice came out hoarse and weak. "There were 2 younger servants. I had to help them first." Draven's jaw tightened, something fierce and protective flashing across his features. "You could have died," he said, the words carrying an accusation, aimed not at her but at himself, at every careful distance he had placed between them over the past weeks, in the name of discipline he no longer fully believed in. He lifted her carefully into his arms, despite her protests that she could walk on her own, carrying her personally toward the healer's quarters, rather than trusting the task to anyone else, his expression daring any guard or servant to comment on the impropriety of a king carrying a maid through his own castle. Beatrice examined her injuries thoroughly, pronouncing them minor, mostly smoke inhalation and scraped hands that would heal within days. But Draven remained beside her bed long after the examination ended, refusing every suggestion that he attend to the ongoing investigation of the fire himself. "Callum will manage the investigation," he said firmly, when Beatrice gently suggested his presence was needed elsewhere. I am not leaving until I know she is truly safe. Illyra, propped against pillows with her throat still raw from smoke, studied him carefully in the quiet that followed Beatrice's departure. You said nothing had changed, she said finally, unable to hold back the question any longer. Yet here you are. Draven was quiet for a long moment, his hands clasped tightly enough that his knuckles had gone pale. I lied, he admitted finally. Not to you, precisely. To myself more than anyone. I told myself distance would protect us both from a danger I understood better than you could. I did not account for the possibility that distance itself might become the danger. What do you mean? Illyra asked softly. Draven met her eyes fully then, something raw and unguarded in his expression that she had glimpsed only once before, beside the fire in his study after the assassin's attack. 5 years ago, he said, I loved someone completely. I trusted her with everything, including my own father's safety, and she used that trust to orchestrate his death in exchange for promises from a rival kingdom that wished to see this castle fall. I have spent every day since, convinced that loving anyone that fully was a weakness I could not afford to repeat. Illyra's chest tightened at the raw honesty of the confession, understanding finally the full weight of what the old ledger had only hinted at. I am not her, she said quietly. I know, Draven said, his voice barely above a whisper. I have known since the moment your scent first reached me in my chambers, since long before I understood what it meant. I pushed you away not because I believed you posed the same danger, but because I did not trust myself to survive losing someone I loved that completely a second time. The confession hung between them, fragile and enormous all at once. Illyra reached out slowly, her scraped hand finding his where it rested against the edge of her bed, and though the gesture was small, she felt something shift in the air between them, some wall finally beginning to crack after 5 long years of careful reinforcement. You do not have to decide everything tonight, she said gently. But please, do not push me away again, simply because loving someone frightens you. I have spent my whole life being pushed away, sold, discarded, treated as though I mattered to no one. I would rather face danger honestly beside you than spend another day being kept at a distance for my own supposed protection. Draven's hand tightened around hers, and for the first time since she had arrived at this cold, unfamiliar castle, she saw something like hope soften the hard lines of his expression. I cannot promise, I will not make mistakes, he said quietly. 5 years of walls do not dismantle themselves easily. But I promise I will not push you away again without first fighting for whatever this is that has grown between us. It was not a declaration of love, not yet, not fully, but it was a beginning, fragile and honest, forged in the aftermath of smoke and fire, and 5 years of careful, guarded distance finally beginning to crack. Illyra drifted into an exhausted sleep that night, with Draven still seated beside her bed, his hand remaining in hers long after she had lost consciousness, unwilling to let go of the first true warmth he had allowed himself to feel in half a decade. Neither of them knew, in that fragile, hopeful moment, how much more danger still waited beyond the walls of the healer's quarters, nor how completely the truth about Garrick's betrayal, and the deeper conspiracy behind it, would soon test whatever fragile trust they had only just begun to build. Callum arrived at the healer's quarters 2 days later, with news that darkened Draven's expression, before he had finished a single sentence. The fire had indeed been set deliberately, the accelerant traced to a supplier, connected directly to Garrick's family, and further investigation had uncovered letters, hidden within the merchant's private study, detailing a plan far more ambitious than a single act of sabotage. He intended to weaken the castle from within before the winter negotiations, Callum explained, spreading the recovered letters across the small table beside Illyra's bed, since she had insisted on hearing the news directly rather than second-hand. Fires, false rumors, and eventually, it seems, an attempt to remove anyone the king showed particular attachment toward, believing a distracted or grieving ruler would be easier to manipulate during negotiations with the southern kingdoms. Illyra's stomach turned cold at the implication. He targeted me specifically, she said quietly, though it was not truly a question. Callum nodded grimly. Once word spread through the merchant circles that the king had taken unusual interest in a particular servant, Garrick saw opportunity rather than danger. Removing you, he believed, would destabilize the king at a critical moment, without directly risking an attack on the crown itself. Draven's expression had gone hard and cold in a way Alira had not seen since her earliest days in the castle. The careful control of a king who had learned long ago how to channel fury into calculated action, rather than reckless anger. "Where is Garrick now?" he asked, his voice deceptively calm. "Detained," Callum said. "He was apprehended attempting to flee toward the southern border late last night. He awaits your judgment." Draven turned to Alira, something searching in his expression. "This does not have to concern you further," he said. "I will handle this matter myself." But Alira, healing hands, still bandaged from the fire, shook her head firmly. "I would like to understand fully what happened," she said. "I have spent too much of my life having decisions made around me without my knowledge. I do not wish that pattern to continue now." Draven studied her for a long moment, before nodding, something like respect settling into his expression, alongside the lingering anger. "Then you shall hear the full account when judgment is passed," he said. "I will not hide this from you." The following days brought a flurry of activity throughout the castle as Callum's investigation expanded, uncovering not only Garrick's involvement, but connections stretching towards several noble families who had grown resentful of the crown's northern trade policies. Draven moved through the unfolding crisis with a focus and clarity that seemed, to those who had served him for years, like a return of the ruler he had been, before grief reshaped him into something colder. Alira, recovering steadily from her injuries, found herself increasingly drawn into conversations with Draven that extended well beyond simple courtesy. He visited the healer's quarters daily, ostensibly to review updates on the investigation, though their discussions inevitably wandered into quieter territory, memories of her childhood before the border raids, stories of his own boyhood before the crown's weight settled onto his shoulders. "I used to love the harvest festivals," he admitted one evening, seated in the chair beside her bed that had, over the past week, become unofficially his own. "My father would let me run wild through the market stalls, tasting everything the vendors offered, until my mother despaired of ever getting me properly fed at the actual feast." Alira smiled at the image, so different from the composed, guarded man she had first encountered in his private chambers weeks earlier. "What changed?" she asked gently, though she suspected she already knew part of the answer. "Everything," Draven admitted. "My father's death forced me into the crown far sooner than I was prepared for, and then, within the same year, the betrayal that taught me trust was a luxury a king in my position could not afford. I built walls after that, layer by layer, until I nearly forgot there was anything beneath them worth protecting." "There is," Alira said softly. "I have seen it, even beneath everything you tried to hide." Draven's hand found hers again, the gesture becoming increasingly natural between them despite the careful boundaries either of them might have once insisted upon. "I know," he said quietly. "It frightens me more than any assassin or any conspiracy ever could, how easily you have found your way past walls I believed impenetrable." Their conversation was interrupted by Percival's arrival, the old historian's expression carrying an urgency that pulled Draven immediately back into his role as king. "Your Majesty," Percival said, bowing briefly, "Garrick has requested an audience before judgment is passed. He claims to have information regarding a conspiracy far larger than his own involvement alone." Draven's expression hardened once more, the warmth of moments before folding back into careful, calculating focus. "Then I will hear him," he said, rising from his chair beside Alira's bed. "Rest," he told her gently. "This matter, I promise, I will handle carefully." Alira watched him leave, uncertain what new dangers Garrick's revelations might uncover, uncertain how much further this conspiracy might reach into the castle's foundations. But she found herself, despite the uncertainty, holding on to something she had not allowed herself to feel since arriving at this cold, unfamiliar place months earlier. A fragile, tentative hope that whatever storm still lay ahead, she would not have to face it entirely alone. That hope would soon be tested more severely than she could have anticipated, as Garrick's confession revealed a truth that struck far closer to the crown than anyone in the castle had dared to suspect, threatening not only the fragile bond growing between Alira and the king, but the very stability of the northern kingdom itself. Garrick knelt in the council chamber with his hands bound, his easy market smile long since vanished, replaced by the pale desperation of a man who understood exactly how narrow his chances of survival had become. Draven stood before him, flanked by Callum and two armed guards, his expression carved from the same cold stone that had once made the entire castle tremble before him. "You claim to have information beyond your own crimes," Draven said, his voice carrying no patience for delay. "Speak plainly, or I will assume this is simply a desperate attempt to buy time you do not deserve." Garrick's throat worked visibly before he found his voice. "Lady Wren," he said finally, the name landing in the chamber like a struck bell. "She approached my family first, months before the assassination attempt, before the fire. She promised support for our southern trade routes if we assisted in weakening your position before the winter negotiations." The chamber fell into stunned silence. Elira, standing quietly near the back of the room at Draven's insistence that she witness the judgment firsthand, felt her breath catch at the revelation. Memories of the elegant noblewoman in violet silk rising unbidden, the woman rumored for years to be the crown's most likely match. Draven's expression did not change, though something in his posture stiffened almost imperceptibly. "Continue," he said, his voice deceptively calm. "She believed," Garrick continued, "that if the maid could be removed, and if enough instability could be sown within the castle, you would eventually turn to her for the stability of marriage, securing her family's southern trade dominance for generations. The assassination attempt in the eastern wing, the fire, both were meant to serve that goal, either by removing the maid directly, or by creating enough chaos that you would seek the security of an advantageous match to calm the kingdom's nerves." Callum's expression had gone carefully blank, the sign of a man calculating rapidly behind a controlled exterior. "Do you have proof of Lady Wren's involvement?" he asked, cutting in before Draven could respond. "Letters," Garrick said quickly, clearly eager to offer anything that might soften his eventual sentence. "Hidden within my family's estate. I can lead you to them myself." Draven turned away from the kneeling merchant, his gaze finding Elira across the chamber, something complicated passing between them in the silent look they shared. He returned his attention to Callum after a long moment. "Send guards to retrieve the letters immediately," he said, "and place Lady Wren under careful watch until the matter is fully confirmed. I want no assumptions made without complete evidence." The guards moved to escort Garrick from the chamber, his fate still undecided pending the full investigation, and slowly, the room began to empty, until only Draven, Callum, and Elira remained. Draven crossed the distance to where Elira stood, his expression carrying a weight she had not seen from him before, somewhere between fury and exhaustion. "You heard everything," he said quietly. "I did," Elira confirmed. "Draven, if this proves true, the danger to you is far greater than I understood. A noble family with that much influence, willing to go this far." "I know," he said grimly, "but I would rather face that danger honestly than allow fear to dictate decisions that concern my own heart. Whatever comes from this investigation, I will not be pressured into any match built on manipulation and violence." Over the following days, Callum's investigation confirmed every detail of Garrick's confession, the recovered letters revealing Lady Wren's careful, calculated campaign, stretching back months before Elira had even arrived at the castle. When guards arrived to formally question her, she offered no denial, her composed elegance cracking into something bitter and resentful as she was led away under guard. "You would choose a maid over the security an alliance with my family could offer this kingdom," she spat at Draven during her final audience before the council, her violet silk now looking more like a costume stripped of its former power. "She is nothing. A servant sold for debts, with no lineage, no standing, nothing to offer beyond whatever scent has clouded your judgment." Draven's expression remained coldly composed, though something fierce burned beneath the surface. "She has offered more honesty in a few short months than you offered in years of careful courtship," he said. "Take her away." The castle settled slowly into calmer waters over the following weeks, as the full conspiracy was unraveled and dealt with. Garrick's family stripped of their trade contracts and exiled from royal favor, Lady Wren's own family facing severe political consequences for her actions, though careful diplomacy prevented the incident from escalating into open conflict with her southern allies. Through it all, Elira remained close to Draven's side, no longer relegated to distant wings or careful distance, but present at his request during council discussions and quiet evenings alike. The castle staff noticed the change immediately, whispers of the king's transformation spreading through the servants' quarters with a warmth that had been absent from those halls for 5 long years. Nora found Alira one evening in the library, no longer cataloging dusty correspondence but simply reading for pleasure, curled comfortably into one of the wide window seats that overlooked the courtyard below. "You look happy," Nora observed, settling beside her friend with genuine warmth in her expression. "Truly happy. Not just relieved that the danger has passed." Alira smiled, something soft and unguarded in her expression that would have seemed impossible months earlier, when she first arrived at this castle, as cargo sold to pay her uncle's debts. "I am," she admitted. "I never expected any of this, Nora. Not the danger, certainly, but not this either. This strange, fragile happiness I keep waiting to disappear." "It will not disappear," Nora said firmly. "Marks do not lie, remember? Whatever fear kept him distant before, I think he has finally understood that some things are worth the risk of trusting again." Alira hoped, with everything in her, that her friend was right. But hope, she had learned over years of hardship, was a fragile thing, and one final test still remained before she could fully believe the storm had truly passed. The council chamber had never been so full, every noble family of standing summoned on Draven's direct order, their curiosity evident in the low murmur that filled the hall as they waited for the king to explain the unusual gathering. Alira stood near the chamber's edge, her simple gray dress a stark contrast to the furs and jewels surrounding her, her heart pounding with an uncertainty she could not fully calm despite Draven's private reassurances the night before. Some of the gathered nobles had already heard whispers of the king's attachment to a servant girl, and their expressions ranged from open curiosity to poorly disguised disdain. Alira caught more than one disapproving glance directed her way, reminders that whatever had grown between her and Draven still faced obstacles far greater than conspiracy and danger. Obstacles built from generations of tradition that insisted kings married for advantage, not affection. Draven entered the chamber with the composed authority of a ruler fully in command, though Alira noticed the slight tension in his shoulders that betrayed nerves he rarely allowed himself to show in public. He took his place at the head of the hall, his gaze sweeping over the assembled nobility, before settling briefly, warmly, on Alira near the chamber's edge. "I have called this gathering," he began, his voice carrying easily through the silent hall, "to address rumors that have spread through this kingdom in recent weeks, and to settle the matter plainly, before speculation causes more harm than the truth ever could." A ripple of anticipation moved through the gathered nobles. Several exchanged knowing glances, clearly expecting confirmation of exactly the scandal they had whispered about in private conversations. 5 years ago, Draven continued, this kingdom suffered a betrayal that cost my father his life, and very nearly cost this crown its stability. I responded to that betrayal by closing myself off entirely, believing that distance and control were the only true protections against ever suffering such loss again. I built my reign on that coldness, and many of you have served faithfully beneath it without complaint. He paused, his gaze finding Alira once more before continuing. But recently, I have learned that true strength is not found in walls built from fear. It is found in the courage to trust again, even after everything trust has cost. The maid many of you have heard whispered about is not simply a passing infatuation, nor a scandal to be managed quietly. She is my true mate, confirmed by the mark that awakened in her presence after 5 years of complete dormancy. A bond that neither ambition nor tradition can undo. The chamber erupted into murmurs, some outraged, some merely startled, and Draven raised a hand for silence before continuing. "I understand. This defies the expectations many of you hold for how a king should choose his queen," he said. "I understand. Tradition favors alliances built on lineage and political advantage. But I have seen, in recent months, exactly what alliances built on ambition alone can cost this kingdom. I have chosen instead to honor a bond that cannot be manufactured through politics, one that has already proven itself through danger and betrayal far more thoroughly than any arranged match ever could." He crossed the chamber then, closing the distance between himself and Alira before the entire assembled court, and though whispers continued to ripple through the hall, he ignored them entirely, his attention fixed solely on her. "I am asking you, before this entire court, to accept the bond that has grown between us," he said, his voice softer now, meant for her alone despite the audience surrounding them. "Not because tradition demands it, and not because duty requires it, but because I have found, in you, something I believed I had lost forever 5 years ago. I am asking you to be my queen, and to help me build a reign defined by trust rather than fear." Illyra felt tears rise unbidden, months of hardship and uncertainty, and fragile hope finally converging into a moment she had never dared to imagine possible. She thought of her uncle's cold dismissal, of the chains around her wrists on that first journey north, of every rule designed to keep her invisible within these castle walls. She thought of how far she had traveled, not simply in distance, but in the slow, unexpected unfolding of a life she had once believed offered her nothing beyond survival. "Yes," she said finally, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes. "I accept. Not because I was sold into this castle, but because somewhere along the way, I chose to stay, and I choose, now, to remain beside you for whatever comes next." The chamber's murmurs shifted gradually from shock toward something closer to acceptance, as Draven drew her into an embrace that cared nothing for propriety or tradition, his relief and joy evident to everyone present, despite years of carefully guarded composure. Percival, watching from near the chamber's edge, allowed himself a rare, genuine smile, recognizing in this moment an echo of the same happiness he had witnessed decades earlier, when Draven's own parents first accepted their bond. Not every noble in the chamber accepted the announcement gracefully, and Draven knew there would be challenges ahead. Political maneuvering from families who had hoped for a more advantageous match, whispered doubts about a servant-born queen's ability to navigate courtly politics. But he faced those future challenges with a steadiness he had not possessed in 5 long years, no longer weighed down by walls built from fear, but strengthened instead by a bond that had proven itself through fire and danger, and honest, hard-won trust. In the months that followed, Illyra settled into her new role, with the same quiet diligence that had once made her an exceptional maid, learning the complexities of court politics with careful attention, earning the respect of skeptical nobles through patience rather than demands. The kingdom, weary from years of a cold, guarded ruler, slowly warmed alongside its king, finding in their new queen a compassion for the common people that had been absent from the crown for far too long. Nora remained her closest friend throughout the transition, though their positions had shifted dramatically from their days shelling peas together in the servants' quarters. Illyra never forgot the kindness shown to her during her most vulnerable months, ensuring that Nora, Petra, Mistress Hollis, and every servant who had shown her genuine warmth found their loyalty rewarded within the new order of the castle. As for her uncle Edmund, word eventually reached him of his niece's unexpected rise to the northern throne, and though he sent letters requesting audience, hoping perhaps to benefit once more from her fortune, Illyra chose not to respond, closing that painful chapter of her life with the same quiet strength that had carried her through every hardship since. On the anniversary of her arrival at the castle, exactly 1 year after chains and cold stone gates had first greeted her, Illyra stood beside Draven on the same balcony, overlooking the courtyard, where guards had once carried her, injured, from smoke and flame. The castle beneath them looked different now, not colder, but calmer, its towers no longer feeling like warnings carved from stone, but simply the steady architecture of a home she had never expected to find. "I was sold to this castle believing I had nothing left to lose," she said quietly, Draven's arms settling warmly around her shoulders, as they watched the sun set over the northern kingdom they now ruled together. "I never imagined I would find everything instead." Draven pressed a gentle kiss to her temple, the mark on his forearm warm and steady beneath his sleeve, no longer a wound reopened by unexpected hope, but a permanent, welcome reminder of the bond that had rescued him from 5 years of careful, lonely coldness. "Neither of us knew," he said softly, "that the coldest winter this kingdom had ever known was simply waiting for the right warmth to finally break it, and I am endlessly grateful. Every single day, that warmth arrived wearing a maid's simple uniform, carrying linens through a doorway she was never meant to enter." Together, they watched the sun disappear behind the northern mountains, the beginning of a reign built not on fear or cold tradition, but on a bond neither danger nor betrayal had ever managed to break, a quiet, hard-won happiness that Illyra, once sold as nothing more than a servant, had somehow, against every impossible odd, finally found waiting for her all along.